March 20th, 2026. We are in the 5th year, day 25 since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Welcome. I greet you to the Situation Report. In today's report, we will look at both the Ukrainian local offensive and the Russian offensive on the Eastern Front, which are currently happening in parallel. We will also take a look at a drone strike on a flying attack helicopter. We'll also see exactly which one it was, because that's quite interesting. And of course, we'll look at many other important things, as always in the Daily Situation Report. So feel free to subscribe so you don't miss anything. And above all, to support the channel for free, which is probably the most important thing. Russian forces are currently testing a new defense system against drones, which is mounted directly onto the underbarrel grenade launcher of Automat Kalashnikova rifles. Unlike previous solutions that were fired through the barrel itself, this system uses the existing grenade launcher platform, which makes replacement for infantry much more practical, and especially its use, because soldiers are familiar with it and can replace it quickly or mount it on any Automat Kalashnikova, which is the standard assault rifle on the Russian side. The principle is relatively simple. A net is fired which unfolds itself in the air and is supposed to catch the drone, just as we've seen in previous attempts. The specified net size is about 4 by 4 meters, with an effective range of 30 to 40 meters, but a maximum of 55 meters before it can no longer be effective. Tactically, this shows one thing above all. The threat from drones has become so great that even at the level of individual shooters, specific counter-drone measures are being developed. Because in the past, we've also looked at net guns or net launchers, but those were always only issued to, let's say, drone specialists or drone shooters, or rather, drone defense shooters. At the same time, the system also makes the limitations clear. The range is still very limited. The time window for use is extremely short, and the shooter has to visually detect the drone, aim at it correctly, and it can't dodge him either. Such systems can work well in certain cases, like stopping nearby incoming drones. They don't replace comprehensive drone defense and serve only as a last resort at close range when other systems fail. The Russian army is increasingly finding that the traditional separation of old combat patterns hardly works anymore in drone warfare. What used to be hidden by tree lines, terrain features, or simple camouflage nets can now be seen almost any time due to constant aerial reconnaissance. Ukraine is responding to this with a significantly adapted defense concept. Instead of relying heavily on natural cover, defensive positions are deliberately designed to be open in order to allow maximum visibility and thus early target acquisition. Open fields, thinned-out tree lines, and clearly structured defensive zones ensure that attacking forces can hardly approach unnoticed anymore. At the same time, these areas are naturally layered in depth. Several defensive lines now interlock with each other, a problem that the Ukrainians have unfortunately only been able to fix recently. They are often anchored to natural obstacles such as rivers and forested areas. They border on these, so they use natural cover and natural terrain features. This creates a system of overlapping zones of fire, where attackers can be detected early and then engaged from different directions, whether it's through artillery, drones, or even anti-tank weapons when they get really close. The crucial point here, however, is adapting to the modern battlefield. It's no longer about camouflage in the traditional sense, but rather about controlling and deliberately exploiting visibility. Whoever sees first can act for, and that's exactly the new kind of defense they're planning for here. The current reports indicate, as we've seen in the recent situation reports, if you look at yesterday's title, you'll see it too, that everything points to the fact that the Russian spring offensive of 2026 has effectively begun. However, there hasn't been a rapid breakthrough yet, which is common for Russian offensives. Often at first, there was nothing at all. Then, well, sometimes territorial gains that, in quotation marks, happen quickly for them, and after that, everything stagnates just as it has been the case every time for the past, well, now 4 years. What stands out are the persistently high personnel losses, which indicates that Russia is once again relying heavily on sheer numbers to put pressure along the front. As we saw yesterday, there was another record high, especially for this year, with 1,710 losses reported on the Russian side. Now we are at similarly high numbers, which means they are still on the offensive, since over the winter we saw significantly fewer losses. At times, we were down to 800 or 900 losses, which is extremely low for the Russian side. But they were not on a constant offensive, and now they have started a new offensive, and you can see that especially in the loss numbers. So that's always a good indicator to see how strongly they are attacking, even though it's not the only decisive factor, but you can use it quite well as a small guideline. But the main focus is in Donetsk Oblast, while the Southern Front currently only plays a very minor role, as is usually the case. The same goes for Ukraine on the Southern Front. I can show you on the situation map here in the Zaporizhia area, as it's called. They have built a huge defensive line there over the past year, parallel to the Surovikin line, which is located here. Here you can still see some defensive structures on the Russian side. Those are from the year 2023. I haven't really updated them since then either, because this area has become rather irrelevant. Ukraine has built the same thing up here, a pretty complex defense network that a lot of money and material has gone into. At the same time, there was another line of defense along the Donbas here, namely the Dnipro line. That's why it's not so surprising that the Russians aren't attacking as much here in the south, in the area of Zaporizhia, or that this area plays a somewhat lesser role. After all, they mainly want to achieve their war goals, or at least one of their war goals, because so far they haven't achieved any. But one of their war goals is the occupation or liberation of the Donbas, and they still haven't liberated or occupied it. And since this war has already been going on for 4 years, it's naturally one of their goals to finally conquer this area completely, which they're now trying to do with this offensive. But what we see, apart from this section of the front, are mainly diversionary attacks, which are probably meant to prevent Ukrainian forces from being redeployed to help out here. At the same time, sources also report that Ukrainian units are continuing to make local advances in the area northeast of Hujapol, which is a bit further southwest from this section of the front. The Ukrainians have recently been able to make some further territorial gains there. I can't mark them yet, because as far as I can tell, my map is still up to date. That was likely reported later or incorrectly. Unsurprisingly, drones appear to be the main element in current combat operations. Ukrainian drone pilots are apparently very busy fending off lightly motorized Russian infantry, for example on ATVs or motorcycles. That ties up resources that could otherwise be used more for artillery reconnaissance. Operationally, this suggests that Russia is once again trying to implement a familiar pattern, an advance from the Pokrovsk area to the northwest with the goal of forming a front arc around Kramatorsk. This could then, similar to Avdiivka, be squeezed from the flanks in order to overwhelm Ukrainian defensive positions operationally. However, the crucial difference compared to previous offensives lies in the course so far. The typical initial successes have not materialized yet. Ukrainian forces seem to be prepared for this approach and are currently able to intercept the attacks before operational breakthroughs can develop. All in all, this results in a familiar but so far not very successful picture. High pressure, heavy losses, but limited territorial gains, while Ukraine at the same time is making its own progress in certain areas, and at least for now, is slowing down the Russian offensive. And drones are continuing to evolve, becoming a real threat even to helicopters, which is becoming increasingly clear, especially at this front distance with a high drone density. The downing of a Russian K-52 near Pokrovsk underscores this impressively. This particular type of helicopter is one of the more valuable and now rarely used platforms, which shows how important this section of the front and Russia's own advance to the northwest currently are. Remarkably, and to be honest, a bit unfortunate, is the connection with almost one of our favorite channels, namely fighter bomber on the Russian side, because he is actually a relatively reliable and realistic account compared to others from this spectrum of Russian sources. In this case, he does confirm that the helicopter was destroyed, which we can also see in various images, but at the same time he claims that the crew is probably safe. However, this statement is now in clear contradiction to further footage showing the crew killed, but strictly speaking, they did survive the crash, just not the subsequent drones. We just briefly touched on the crash here, but I'll go into it in a bit more detail. Ukrainian forces are continuing their operation to retake the Dnipropetrovsk region. According to current reports, only a few remaining Russian forces are still in isolated positions here, which, according to the Ukrainians, are now being cleared. That means they are continuing to advance here, trying to capture more positions, and at some point to establish control over the area again. But as I said, for me, this is still the current state of the map and above all the current situation. Unfortunately, it's often the case that some things are only reported officially 1 or 2 weeks later, while I've already marked them here, especially when it comes to territorial gains. The offensive of the Russian Fifth Army, which has been ongoing since October 2025, is taking place a bit further south, namely here in this area. It was stopped in particular by the battle group around the 225th Assault Regiment. Since then, the fighting in this section has clearly taken on a positional character. In addition to the increasing exhaustion of Russian units, the Ukrainian counteroffensive on the right flank, namely by Group Vostok in the Vervov area, has likely contributed significantly to the stabilization. Those are the counterattacks we just reviewed. Instead, Russian forces were only able to achieve limited territorial gains west of Hujapol, especially in the area of Hill 163. There, the units of the 57th succeeded. Motorized Rifle Brigade, after prolonged fighting, managed to capture the eastern parts of the hill. At the same time, the 38th Brigade advanced along the railway line and occupied large parts of the summit area, including the burial mounds. Nevertheless, the hill remains contested as Ukrainian forces, specifically the 1st Battalion of the 154th Mechanized Brigade, continue to hold the northwestern slope. Another focal point is in the area around Salitsnitsa, which is this location here, where Russian forces are trying to break through a Ukrainian blocking position. This extends for more than 10 kilometers in length and about 1.5 kilometers in width from this location further to the west. This is the one here, which we already looked at last time, at the height of Hill 133. At the same time, the Russian side is also showing increased infiltration attempts, as soldiers of the 114th Regiment are operating along the road towards Obolink and are increasingly advancing towards Kuljapilsky. Dismounted groups alone regularly reach the area of a destroyed bridge over the river, which of course causes problems on the Ukrainian side. Movements are of course possible because a certain section of the front is currently not continuously physically occupied. The terrain there is limited by natural and artificial obstacles, such as the river to the north or the parallel tank ditch to the south. This creates a kind of corridor that smaller units can of course take advantage of to move there unnoticed. Overall, however, in the area of Kuljapili, we see a typical picture of modern combat operations. Static front lines with local advances, intense infiltrations, and a high importance of key terrain, without either side currently being able to achieve a significant operational breakthrough. Thanks to all subscribers, Karamik, the Algin crew, and special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renica, Silla, Dietrich, Ferdi, and Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next situation report.